start. Thank you. I'd like to start tonight by acknowledging that we're meeting wherever we are on the unceded lands of First Nations people. My name's Dave Sweeney. I'm emceeing tonight and I'm talking from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nations in Naarm in Melbourne. So do feel free to put your location or acknowledgement in the chat. And as we've been advised, this meeting is being recorded and the chat will be captured and both will be available on the IPAN website as a way to enable people who can't join us tonight to access this, or as a future resource for contacts and resources and events. So just to advise you of that, if anyone's got any concerns about privacy or confidentiality, perhaps take your camera off or do whatever.
Remember, I haven't got the normal power that I had before.
Do whatever is necessary to deal with those concerns. And can I once again, please ask folks to put themselves on mute. Mute your speaker, and then background noise won't interrupt for others. It's important to note First Nations people, and it always is, but it's important particularly in the context of a discussion around militarism and nuclear concerns, because there are often profoundly disproportionate impacts and consequences for First Nations people here and globally. Tonight's session is looking at Aukus, and under the title of Aukus Will Cost the Earth. And obviously these are difficult and uncertain days. We've got escalating geopolitical tension. We have the start of what looks like an increasingly serious conflict in Ukraine. We have increasing preferencing of war fighting preparations rather than peace building and diplomacy around the world. We also have the continuing constraints of the uncertainty and the constraints upon mobilising in the age of COVID and against the backdrop of a federal election. So we've got some real challenges as we look to build an inclusive and effective peace movement and challenge the dominant narrative. Like I said, my name's Dave Sweeney. I lead ACF's Nuclear Free Work, ACF being the Australian Conservation Foundation. I lead their nuclear free work and was a co-founder or involved in the early days with ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So I'm very pleased to be asked by IPAN and the Victorian No Orcas Coalition to MC tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to our speakers and our discussion. I want to start by acknowledging the groups and the people who have made this happen, especially IPAN, the Independent Peaceful Australia Network, and the Victorian No Orcas Coalition, and also the organising and endorsing groups that have made this possible. And they include the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, Pax Christi, the Melbourne Unitarian Church, the MUA, the Spirit of Eureka, CICD, the Melbourne May Day Committee, the Philippines Caucus for Peace, and the Philippines Australia Solidarity Association, Living Incomes for Everyone, Solidarity, and the International League of People's Struggles, the Australian chapter of ILPS. Today is February 24th, and 23 weeks ago today, Prime Minister Morrison parted the waters and emerged with the surprise announcement of AUKUS, increased military engagement with the US and the UK, enhanced cyber and artificial intelligence, greatly increased military spending, including over $100 billion on the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. We are now nearly 1/3 of the way along the PM's 18-month consultation process. The federal government has said that this will lead to a pathway to operationalise AUKUS. Now, we're a third along that pathway, but the details are scant, but the intent is very clear. The saber-rattling rhetoric has increased. For the first time in over a decade, a UK nuclear submarine has ported out of Fremantle. There's been big defence expenditure, and they have been signed off on and put in place. When the PM announced AUKUS, the head of the Navy, Vice Admiral Michael Noonan, described the move as one that will no doubt change the shape of our nation. Well, if our nation is changing shape, we need to be engaged, because I have no doubt whatsoever that those of us on this Zoom would shape our nation differently and far preferably than the vision of PM Morrison and Defence Minister Dutton. So tonight we're lucky to hear from two deeply engaged and informed speakers, Dr. Margie Beavis from Medical Association for the Prevention of War and ICAN, and Professor Richard Tanter from the Nautilus Institute at Melbourne Uni. We'll also have a pretty dynamic chat stream with links to contacts, resources, and coming events, as well as your observations and questions. And we'll have a good chance to explore these questions in conversation following the more formal presentation. So let's get the wheels on the bus and the show on the road and hear from our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Margie Beavis, or Margaret Beavis, and she wears a number of hats, as many of us do, but Margie wears them with great style. She's a practicing GP. She lectures in medicine and public health at Melbourne University. She's the convener of the Australian chapter of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or co-convener. And she's a co-director of Quit Nukes. And in her spare time, she's the National Secretary of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War. Now, medicos take an oath to do no harm. Well, Margie has signed off on that, and she's added another one, which is to do a lot of good. And it's a great pleasure to welcome her tonight. And one more time, folks, one more time. Before Margie joins us, I'd ask everyone, please, to put yourselves on mute and keep it that way, because it just makes it so much easier for speakers. So thanks very much for your attention. Thanks very much for your presence and input tonight, Margie Beavis.
Thanks, Dave. I have to confess I recently retired from general practice to look after my granddaughter, so I don't have quite as many hats as I used to. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to do a slideshow, so I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me for a moment. I'm just checking you can hear me. No? I think I'm going to have to stick with the slides at the bottom, at the side. I lose the screen, unfortunately, if I try to do it as a actual presentation. So I'm just going to go through with this, so my apologies. So what I'm going to do today is talk about what my section, an overview of what the costs of the submarine section is. Aukus is clearly a massive commitment over and above the submarines, but for the purposes of tonight, I'm largely going to focus on the submarines. So financial costs, health costs, and the social costs, all of which are massive. As all of you would be aware, the French submarines started off at 50 billion, then moved up to 80 and then 89 billion without anyone really blinking an eye. The lifetime total sustainment was a minimum of 225 billion. So the sort of guesstimate that we're getting from the government of over 100 billion is, I put the emphasis on the over. There's really no, this is an open checkbook, and we really don't know what our liability actually is in terms of financial cost. It's interesting that a number of experts in the field have come out and said that, should we be getting conventional submarines? If you agree that Australia needs submarines, and I'm not going to go into that debate, we could get 12 ultra quiet German submarines in the next few years for 10 billion. And others have said that it's really foolishness to get the nuclear subs, because in terms of actually getting them delivered and having control, as well as getting local content, the nuclear subs make no sense at all, and actually asks if Australia's defence procurement can actually have a modicum of common sense, which has been sadly lacking. The politics of these submarines and Orcas is pretty clear. A khaki election would suit the incumbents. and it was clearly an attempt to divide the ALP. It also is a wonderful look over here moment. It distracts from climate change, the bushfires, the floods, the appalling situation of the reef, and so many other parts of Australia, which Dave will talk about later. The federal mismanagement of the pandemic, which has been breathtaking, failures in quarantine, the vaccine rollout was incredibly delayed and highly problematic, and then rats tests, overpayments to Harvey Norman that haven't been reclaimed. The failures are myriad. The lack of an anti-corruption commission, the treatment of women, both in Parliament and in the broader community, incarceration of Indigenous and youth, and also, asylum seekers who have committed no crime, but 8 years down the track, a 15-year-old is still in detention in Melbourne, along with quite a few others, and that's just a national scandal. So it's a terrific distraction. It also works to appease the South Australians, who are pretty pissed off when Tony Abbott basically closed the car industry with loose talk and unsympathetic approach. And it's also consistent with the massive amount of undue influence, both of mining companies but particularly weapons companies in this situation. And if any of you missed it, I'd really strongly recommend the Australian Democracy Network #StateCapture. They put out a terrific report last week. I think Australian Conservation Foundation, where Dave works, had a lot to do with setting up Australian Democracy Network. But it's a really impressive piece of work that encapsulates an enormous amount that's been going on in our society for years, that you thought this is wrong and this is wrong. This actually synthesizes it and really puts it together, and is a really impressive piece of work. I commend it all to you. With regard to the Orcas alliance, it's hard to believe that further outsourcing Australian foreign policy makes us more secure. And I'm sure Richard will go into this in much more detail. But further enmeshing the Australian military with the US military seems really unwise and unsafe. And we've already joined way too many wars that have not achieved very much at all at the bidding of the US. And I'd really strongly, again, commend the work of the IPAN's People Inquiry and ask people to go to that source and have a look at that work, because again, that's really an impressive piece of work. I think there's more to come on that as well. So what really does make people more secure? Well, think about possibly we could have some long-term strategic planning on climate change. And again, I'm sure Dave will cover that. Having an independent foreign policy, having active diplomacy, and a properly funded and led diplomatic service. We have been reducing our diplomatic service. We're way down on the OECD average in terms of our diplomatic capability. And it's been consistently cut. What's interesting also is the new head of DFAT, which is really the head of diplomacy in Australia, is actually Kate Campbell, who is a serving Major General in the reserves of the Australian Army. And to put an Army person in charge of diplomacy, they're different. It's a cat and a dog, diplomacy and defence, and they work together, but it's very depressing to have military people in charge of diplomacy. Adequate funding for healthcare and aged care should be a given, but that makes people more secure. Other issues, there's many, but addressing poverty, access to housing, closing the health gap and other gaps for the Indigenous peoples of this nation, even just providing services to those who are at risk of domestic violence. I could go on for a long time, so I had to just select a few things that I felt would make Australia more secure. So climate change, as I said, Dave's going to talk about this, but the opportunity cost, what are we not doing instead? Imagine if the 18 months was spent with over 150 public servants really doing it properly with strategic long-term planning. And I'll let Dave talk about that more later. Diplomacy, again, we're not focusing on diplomacy. We have managed with the submarine proposal to really annoy the French, and Malaysia and Indonesia and a number of other countries in our region are very disturbed at the direction in which Australia is heading. It's really at risk of setting off a regional arms race, and also the inflammatory remarks about China are not helping the prospects of peace. Healthcare. Now, Shirley, when she asked me to talk about this, said, could I highlight the influence of lack of funds on the pandemic mismanagement? I hate to say it, I don't think it's lack of funds that have been the stuff up. I think it's basically they're incompetent. That the competence levels of this government in handling the pandemic are really highly questionable at a federal level. And I don't know that focusing on the military issues certainly may have distracted them, but I think there's underpinning problems in how they addressed it from the start. The public hospital system was way underfunded before the pandemic started, long waiting lists. People in general practice, I have a woman who I put on a list because she had terrible pain. She's waited 3 years to get her appointment in a pain clinic. People will wait 18 months to 2 years to get joint replacements. And that's pre-COVID. Medicare has been slowly undermined. Again, I've been over 30 years in general practice. 30 years ago, you could get pensioners in to see private specialists and they would bulk bill them. You can't do that anymore because the Medicare rebate barely covers the cost of the rooms the specialist works in and the reception staff that they hire to do it, to be their receptionists. The Medicare rebates have fallen, which means the out-of-pocket costs have massively increased for people. There was a Productivity Commission report into government services that came out recently saying that 18%, so nearly 1 in 5 people whose mental health is sufficiently bad that they've been sent to a psychiatrist didn't go because of cost. And that's a pretty scandalous thing for a government that says it's providing free healthcare. So there's also been really poor planning and underfunding of preventative healthcare. And the coming budget repair is terrifying because that's going to justify even more cuts. The AMA has come out saying that, and this is again, 4 years, so we're talking pre-pandemic, 32 billion has been stripped from the hospital system. And again, delaying treatment by underfunding, having bed shortages, actually makes things worse for people. So the health issues become more complicated and more expensive to treat. It is financially stupid to have this backlog of cases because it just means things get worse for people on a personal level, but also from a government budget level makes things more expensive. The AMA also said that if they properly funded GPs, they could save a lot of hospital admissions, again, saving people a lot of health issues and a lot of misery, but also saving the government bottom line an enormous amount of money. So I think the further cuts that are going to come with Orcas are going to make this whole situation even worse. Aged care. The Aged Care Royal Commission was a very impressive piece of work. People want to stay at home as long as they can. And again, it's much cheaper if people stay at home. Putting people into aged care is highly expensive. We need to be paying nursing home staff appropriate wages instead of the really low hourly rates that people are getting. And the staff ratios with nurses and patients are not safe. Again, this is money, instead of spending money on submarines, we could be spending it on this and having a much more secure old age for a lot of Australians. I don't know about you, but I find the difference between 1 million and 1 billion, it's just a lot of money. I think the brain is not terribly well focused on what actually you can get with a billion versus a million. So in 2019, the Australia Institute put out, I've got 2 slides on this, just 5 billion, not the 100 billion of the subs, but just 5 billion will buy a lot of schools, a lot of teachers, new hospitals, and nurses, doctors, rescue vehicles, and police officers, and still have money to spare. So I'm just going to go back. So that's 50 primary schools, 50 secondary schools, 3,500 teachers, 3 hospitals, nurses, doctors, fire rescue vehicles, police officers, and that's just 5 billion. So recklessly putting 100 billion into submarines that a lot of people think we don't need is gobsmacking. What else makes Australians more secure, really, rather than the illusion of subs that may never happen? Not living in poverty, having a house, access to a lawyer when they're in trouble, and closing the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In Australia, and again, I've gone to 2020 report because this is pre-COVID. Things changed with COVID, not necessarily for the better, temporarily for the better, but certainly in the long run, not for the better. 1 in 8 live below the poverty line, and that's 1 in 6 children. And most of these people are really desperately poor, so nearly $300 below what the minimum would be to not be at the poverty line. The youth allowance and New Start even below, even having got the meagre $25 a week increase that lasted after COVID, is still well below the poverty line. And who is being affected most? Well, it's actually children in sole parent households. If you look at this slide, and the red bar is where you draw the poverty line at 50% of median income. The black bar is if you draw it at 60%, and there's argument between the two. But between 40 and 50% of children, so 40 or 50% of children in sole parent households are living in poverty. And overall, between nearly 20% and 25% are living in poverty. So it's children that are being most badly affected. And if you look at where we sit with the OECD, again, our unemployment benefit, before the $25 a week increase, we were the worst out of all the OECD. With that $25 increase, we managed to sneak ahead of Greece. So we're the second worst in the OECD. And I don't think that's a matter of pride. We should be making Australians more secure by giving them unemployment support that is actually a genuine safety net, instead of condemning them to grinding poverty that makes it incredibly difficult to get a job. Social housing, same story. Years of inadequate investment, a shortfall of nearly 500,000 buildings. The current plans don't even keep up with the increase in demand, and we desperately need more money to go into public housing. In the 2016 census, that's the most recent data, because the census from last year, the official data doesn't come out till the middle of this year. So the most recent census we have data for show that there's 116,000 homeless people, and we're not even keeping up with that. We need to eliminate the backlog, and to eliminate the backlog in the next 15 years, we need to build $36,000 a year, 36,000 buildings a year. And ironically, that's 5 billion too, a bit like the Australia Institute picture. Sadly, some of the people that are seeking housing are women and children fleeing domestic violence. And it's the main reason that women and children seek homeless services. And only 3.2% currently receive long-term housing. And then, as an example, in Hobart, there was a shelter the Hobart Women's Shelter, 3 out of 4 women were turned away when they're in desperate need. You don't go to a homeless shelter with your kids unless you're absolutely desperate. And 3 out of 4 of those women were turned away. Now, if we were talking about making Australia more secure, this is where we should be going. We shouldn't be listening to weapons companies saying just buy more stuff. The myth of legal aid. Legal issues often compound situations when people have got really big social and economic challenges. And most people who are below the poverty can't even get legal aid because it's been stripped. The Law Council said that the Law Council is not famous for being radical, that basically legal aid's been pushed to the brink of collapse because of successive cuts. I think it's worth mentioning how appalling defence procurement has been for Australia in the last little while. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighters are terrible planes. They can be shot out of the sky by older jets, and they've got major technical flaws. The frigates have major design issues, which will make them very slow. The 47 Taipan helicopters we had into service in 2017 are about to be scrapped. The Jindalee over-the-horizon radar is way over budget and time frame. The Auditor General is scathing about the Thales Bushmaster purchases. These submarines are really yet another illustration of major failings in the defence procurement in Australia. Finally, closing the gap. This, of all things, needs really long-term planning, commitment. This shouldn't be going to submarines. We should be looking at the Uluru Statement. We should be looking at treaty. We should be listening to the need for self-determination in addressing all the issues that are needed to be addressed to close the gap. Indigenous people need to be absolutely central and involved, so people will listen and reform and invest. So be it whatever they're doing, it should be nothing about them without them. It's the only successful approach. Anyway, that's all things to make people more secure rather than these nuclear submarines. And at this point, I'll hand over to Dave. Thank you very much for listening.
In Melbourne.
Thank you.
Dave, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Margie Beavis. That was great. There's a lot of love in the chat and a lot of people saying that that was really high quality information, contemporary and really clearly presented. And I fully concur with that. That was really good. There's some interesting stories and questions in the chat. They'll be captured and we'll get to discuss them soon. I also wanted to note that there's people from all around the country tonight, which is great. And normally it's a crew from either Western Australia or Northern Territory that win the award for longest distance from where the Zoom is happening. But today it's absolutely standout. It's Annie joining us from London, from CND in London, where they've got a struggle on there for 250 billion pounds on a Trident submarine upgrade, which is insane. So Annie, thanks for joining us. That sense of, connection across the waves at this time is really important. Margie's highlighted some really powerful medical, human and opportunity costs of militarism. I'm just going to touch on some of the profound environmental costs and basically keep it focused on one dimension of the Aukus arrangement, which is the nuclear subs and the increasing nuclearisation dimension. Australian environment groups hold a number of key concerns over Aukus. One is the Trojan horse aspect of nuclear submarines being a stealth vehicle for promoting domestic nuclear power and an increasing integration from, into the international nuclear industry in Australia. When Prime Minister Morrison made the subs call, straight away, the Mineral Council of Australia, who is a very active promoter and advocate for nuclear power, was out calling for this to be the entry point for a domestic nuclear industry. They're strongly supported by a continuing campaign in the Australian newspaper and on Sky TV. And there are strong believers and backers in conservative politics, particularly in the Nationals, at a federal level and the Liberal Democrats at various state levels. There's already, since Aukus has been announced, we've seen money flowing to new nuclear engineering university courses. So the whole package of increasing Australia's connectedness to, dependence on and involvement with a domestic and international nuclear industry is a real concern for us. Another dimension or expression of that is a growing pressure around nuclear and radioactive waste. Currently, the federal government is pushing a plan, deeply controversial and unpopular, for a national radioactive waste site at a town called Kimber on the Eyre Peninsula in regional South Australia. Now, the Aboriginal traditional owners of that country, the Bungala people, have been explicitly excluded from a highly curated consultation process. They are fundamentally, absolutely opposed to this plan, and they're currently shaping up for a fight in the federal court to contest it. But the push is on from Canberra to find a place that's out of sight, out of mind to put Australia's radioactive waste. And we're concerned that the Aukus move could put extra pressure that sees Kimber move from a suboptimal site for radioactive waste to a submarine site for radioactive waste. And that would also increase pressure for Australia to host international waste. As many of you all know, that is a theme that circles back in Australian community and domestic politics. Another issue on the front that concerns environmentalists about Aukus is the many unknowns, not to sound too much like Rumsfeld, but there are many, many unknowns in relation to this. There's uncertainty about the impact on public, on the environment, on port communities. There are threats to our seas, our coasts, and our people. And nuclear subs have accidents, even in times of non-conflict. 9 have sunk outside of combat. Nuclear subs also have very limited containment and safety mechanisms compared to terrestrial nuclear facilities. And the terrestrial ones, as we know, have proven to be risky and vulnerable. So there are high risk and high cost considerations. And we see the nuclear dimension of Aukus in particular as directly undermining the international cooperation and the national resourcing that we so desperately need to urgently address real human problems, real security threats, especially, as Margie mentioned, unchecked climate chaos. I won't go into the full extent of climate change in Australia and its impacts, but we are watching places that never burn. We are watching the barrier reef bleach. We are seeing before our eyes fundamental changes in weather patterns and the health of our nation. We need to address that before we start posturing around nuclear submarines. So look, there are many reasons to be concerned and active about this issue, and our next speaker both makes the case for scrutiny, but importantly, he's been shining a spotlight on a lot of dark places and projects for many years. Professor Richard Tanter is a senior associate with the Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainability at Melbourne Uni, and honorary professor at Melbourne Uni School of Political and Social Sciences. He's worked on peace and security and environmental issues, particularly in East and Southeast Asia, for many decades. He's also done detailed analysis of Australia's defence and foreign policy positioning and been a real leader in examining the impacts of regional militarism and the role and consequences of US bases in Australia. Richard has been published widely, quoted everywhere from the Wall Street Journal to Pravda to 3CR, and we are very grateful for his efforts and for joining us tonight. So welcome here tonight, Richard.
Dave, thanks very, very much for that. I don't like to start with corrections, but I think neither Nautilus Institute nor University of Melbourne would be very happy to be identified with each other. Luckily for me, they are very different institutions. One works on security and sustainability, and the other is called Melbourne University with all of its problems. What Dave has said and what Margie has said is extraordinarily important, and I really don't want to repeat much of what they said, but I will touch on a couple of things. But let me just start. I'm in Sydney. I live in Melbourne, in Brunswick, in Naarm, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and even in Sydney, a place I'm looking out a dark window I know almost nothing about, except that it is, as one wonderful book recently published by Dennis Foley and Peter Reid said, what the colonists never knew about the place that they conquered. And that's something which I've thought about a great deal in my own life and where we live. And I look out this window, I have no idea really what was there, and that's part of, I'm supposed to be educated. Let me turn to my main issue. What we're talking about today is something which is deeply dangerous, which is something deeply retrograde. It is taking us backwards. It is, in defence terms, and I'm going to be asking the peace movement talk about defence, something which is throwing away almost the last fig leaf, going back to the days really of Malcolm Fraser and the Hawke and Keating defence policies, where they actually did talk about self-reliance, and in most things they meant it. That is really almost torn up completely. Margie has talked about what I guess we would call the opportunity costs of the submarines, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the preface I want to make is that this is part of a wider pattern. We have been doing this more and more often. We think in the absolutely typical example of it, the ship that we sent, HMAS Adelaide, to Tonga to try and help the people of Tonga after the volcano and the catastrophe there. First of all, it was ridden with COVID, so we were sending COVID overseas. It couldn't operate for a time because of that. And then it couldn't operate at all because its power system failed. It's a ship which is twice the size of its predecessor and about a quarter as useful. We have this pattern of building now oversized, overpriced, underperforming, not fit for purpose defence equipment. And what's remarkable is that this is not called out in the public arena, certainly not by people in my profession, and certainly not by a very tame set of defence correspondents in our newspapers. Alliance wars is what is on our mind at the moment, and just to make the point, that alliance wars are what we do. All of our wars have been alliance wars. And really, in the time that I've been alive, they've ended in defeat. Not that victory would have been a very good thing in any case, but they've been, in fact, defeats. The most recent of which, in Afghanistan, was almost not remarked upon in the orgy of confected sympathy for Afghans in the collapse of Kabul and the removal of the NATO US-led forces there. It was a defeat. It was a disgrace. We live with this disgrace in the daily newspapers, watching a trial happening in Sydney about what are clearly evidence of Australian war crimes. The costs to Australian society, Margie talked about a great deal, but I think if you then look at the need at the issue of suicide amongst our veterans, these are people who we ask to go, not just to be killed for us, but to kill people. That carries a burden, and the burden belongs to the whole society, and we are failing that deeply and appallingly. Margie mentioned state capture, the really fine piece of work that Flick Ruby and Scott Ludlam led for the Australian Democracy Network. I commend it to you, and I hope that just the beginning of a deepening account. I'll come back to that because the whole question of foreign influence is bandied about in the parliament and the media, in our newspapers, and yet Orcas is a prime example of that at a state level and a corporate level. What's Orcas? The organisers asked me to try and say a little more about that. I think it really is the latest instalment of our habitual clutching to empire. Empire is a word we don't use very much, but it is exactly what we are doing there. The old empire and, well, the not so new and decrepit empire. It's, as I said, abandoning the really very important and I think still feasible goal of self-reliance for defence. It's also, and there's something for people that look like me deeply shaming about this, that this is a white fellas club. This is really going back to old England and the sort of America that people like John Howard liked a great deal, and our current Prime Minister likes a great deal. It may seem like social, sciencey, lefty confabulations, but it is really not about alliance of little democracies. It's about alliance of racialized identity. Penny Wong actually gave a very good speech a little while ago in which she made the very obvious and important point, but neglected widely. Unless we know who we are, how on earth can we say what it is that we want and who we want to be with? And that means, another phrase, if we're going to talk about the decolonisation of Australia from empire and being independent and self-reliant, then we also have to work out what it is that's holding us back, addressing the deep fractures in our society and the fact that we can't face a history of all Australians. That's another of the things that Margie and Dave were talking about in terms of what would make a really secure Australian society. What's Aukus? We're going backwards, it's retrograde, and it's another instalment of looking at empire for protection. I'll talk about the submarines in a moment, but really we know very, very little about what Aukus is meant to be. We have two sets of statements apart from the Prime Minister's and Mr. Biden's statements. In September, we have statements at what's called AUSMIN, the Australia-US Ministerial Talks, which took place late last year. And we have AUKMIN, a new set of Australia-UK ministerial talks that took place a couple of weeks ago. It's very thin gruel. We know very, very little about this. And so really this is an argument for saying, which I'll come back to in a moment, say this peace movement has to be part of this. But we have to find out exactly what is meant by new forms of cooperation in military industry. We do not have an Australian industry and defence industry. Despite the best efforts of Mr. Turnbull and Christopher Pyne, we still really only have the branch offices of particularly United States and European, the giant monopolistic defence companies here. The UK, of course, is a major arms exporter there, but we don't really know what's going to be involved in this, apart from the question of the submarines. And so that's a question for peace movement researchers and for our political allies. There's going to be more cooperation in cyber matters, in cyber warfare in particular. And please start from the presumption that when our government and the US government talks about the possibility of foreign penetration by, say, Chinese, Russian, or who knows what cyber attacks, do recall that the motto, you can see it on the website of the Australian Signals Directorate, our most important intelligence agency, which says, protect our secrets, penetrate theirs. In other words, we are at least as much involved in cyber offence as we are in defence. And that, in particular, has something to do with Pine Gap. It's a very important part of that. We need to remember in all of this that the United Kingdom is a highly dysfunctional state these days. I'm not talking about Boris Johnson with his toddler haircut, but the fact that Britain, outside of the EU, it's frankly a nothing state in international relations, except with its residues of the past of empire and these new inventions. There's a sense that Orcas, in that sense, in the Orc-Min part, or the Australia-UK part of it, is a kind of participation in a shared delusion. I think that's actually a really important thing to understand, that there are huge elements of fantasy there. And remembering that the United States itself, we no longer have a rather insane proto-fascist in the White House, and I say that advisedly, but we still have a liberal militarist who has a record of being a very firm supporter of the nuclear alliance. So it's something that deeply retrograde step there. We don't know much more than that. We need to be asking, and I guess I want to say is this is not actually rocket science. These are things which we can find out, and we need much more work like the state capture study. Moving on to the submarines, because they really are important to understand. They're not for the defence of Australia. They have a very different purpose. But before I get to the purpose, let's just remember what we're talking about. They're trying to build ocean-going vessels made of steel. They're trying to build ocean-going vessels which will be submerged for long periods of time. They're trying to build ocean-going submerged vessels for a long period of time, which will dive to great depths of up to 400 meters. These are technically very, very difficult things to do and to sustain. And then to do it for combat conditions, which will be horrendous in many, many different ways. These are incredibly difficult technical, organisational and military feats to perform. And our government has offered no rationale whatsoever in serious strategic terms as to why we need to commit ourselves to nuclear-powered submarines. That issue goes to the heart of the question, which I very rarely see, I never see openly discussed by the Australian government, and very rarely by the commentariat, and not much actually in the peace movement. The technical characteristics of any weapons platform, which is what submarines are, depends on their purpose. What are they there for? What is their strategic purpose? That dictates what their characteristics have to be, if that can be done. These are not being designed for the defence of Australia, for the Arafura Sea, for the Java Sea, or even much for the South China Sea. They are designed for long-range activities. The reason you want nuclear-powered submarines is they can be away from home for a long period of time. What's interesting is that nuclear-powered submarines are not particularly stealthy. They're not particularly quiet. They can be quite quiet, but if you think about it, if you have a small nuclear reactor on board, what you have to do is keep it cool. You have to keep cool water moving around it and through it. That's a very, very difficult thing to keep quiet. Now, the United States does it much better than anyone else, and maybe they'll let us into that secret, but it is not a guarantee. Moreover, I think Margie and Dave both mentioned the possibility of diesel-electric submarines, which don't have the range we're talking about the American British submarines talk about, but they are capable, when they're in electric battery mode, of being extraordinarily quiet. And that is precisely what we need, really, for our principal defence needs in our worst case, which is some kind of seaborne force against Australia. And that's not really something we're going to be contesting in the East China Sea. It's something much closer to home. So these are not involved in the defence of Australia. But more importantly, what they clearly are designed for is assistance to the United States nuclear powered or nuclear navy in containing Chinese surface and submarine vessels and making it possible for US aircraft carrier task forces to attack China in the air, in the sea, and on the ground. It used to be the case until about 10 years ago that an American admiral could be fairly sure that if he or she took a large carrier task force, a big aircraft carrier, destroyers, frigates, submarines protecting it, close to the Chinese mainland, they had nothing very much to fear. China doesn't have much capacity to project power now, but it has a capacity to make that kind of incursion into Chinese waters a much more dangerous proposition. These submarines that we are apparently signing up for, should they ever eventuate, and that's a big question, they are in part designed to protect those American task force, aircraft carrier task forces by screening out, by looking for Chinese submarines trying to attack those American carriers, and for another, much more important function, contributing to the American hunt for China's 4, 5, currently probably 6 ballistic missile submarines. These are the submarines which they're not very good, they're not going to sea very often, they're not quiet, but the Chinese are hoping that if all of their other maybe 250, maybe 300 land-based missiles are destroyed by the Americans in the first strike, which is certainly would be an aim of the United States, then the United States would also face the possibility of attack from those Chinese ballistic submarines in this horrible logic of nuclear warfare and nuclear deterrence. What we are contributing to is helping the Americans to vitiate what China will regard as its very last protection against American attack. Now, you might not want to say that nuclear deterrence is something we want to believe in or support, but it's certainly not something that we want to contribute to undermining in terms of an existential threat to China. China's going to be there forever. So that's the situation of submarines. Many people have asked, and Margie made the point, we have no idea how much these are going to cost. The submarines, which under Tony Abbott were going to cost 25 billion, cost 40 billion when Turnbull ordered them from the French. They then admitted when they cancelled the contract that they knew it was between 90 and 100 billion dollars just for the purchase price. And as Margie said, lifetime cost at least 2.5 times that, if not more. We have no idea. It's a blank check which is going to soak up every little bit of opportunity cost available in an already deeply bloated defence budget. We might, it is now said by the people who hang around defence press rooms, we might lease submarines. We might lease submarines? What does that mean? Well, the hard-nosed people are pointing out that the Americans and the British actually don't have submarines to spare. But one point to make is the Americans have fomented this. The British nuclear ballistic missile submarines, there are 4 of them. One goes to sea all the time. They each carry 12 to 15 very powerful Trident II missiles on board. Those missiles are not British. They're not made in Britain. They are, sorry, I got interrupted by a call then. Those missiles are not made in Britain. They're leased from the United States. Every year or so, each of those 4 ballistic missile submarines goes across the Atlantic to Kings Bay in Georgia to swap them out for a new lot. This is really the kind of idea that we want to be involved in. It makes the notion of dependence, it's words fail me in terms of that kind of possibility. There's a very good chance that we won't ever get these submarines, that the dysfunctional qualities of our government, our defence policy, the UK government, probably soon to be the DUK, the disunited kingdom, and let alone the United States. This is something we really can't make any sensible statement that this is how they're going to come about. What I want to talk about though now is relevant to, it's highly relevant to what is beginning to unfold, not so much in the Ukraine, but in Canberra. And this is what I call global NATO. This is the question of how Aukus fits in a wider context of the way in which the United States has been encouraging through NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, for that to be at the front to run wars in cooperation with the United Nations in the 20-year war in Afghanistan. That was a NATO war. The International Security Assistance Force was controlled by NATO, not entirely simply a front by the Americans, but always with the Americans as primus there. And again in Syria and in Iraq. Australia is one of NATO's 4 Asian, quote unquote, global partners: Australia, India, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Australia is now a so-called enhanced global partner. That cooperation over 20 years in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria built very strong institutional, political, technological, and career connections between the Australian military and the militaries of those 30-odd countries in NATO, particularly, of course, Britain, the United States, but also with France. The United States is constructing very clearly a multi-layered, a new form of alliance, not simply America and Japan, American South Korea, America, Australia, but rather American Australia, American Japan, but certainly Japan and South Korea cooperating together, if the Americans can ever make that work, which is unlikely, but more importantly, NATO as a way of jumping from a well-integrated North Atlantic-based organisation led by the United States to one which is effectively global. And Australia has this long habit of wanting to be part of this. We seem not to be able to act like Swedes or Norwegians or Indonesians and be perfectly content to be both self-reliant and self-assured about our place in the world. We've got to be part of global NATO. We've got to be part of Orcas. We've got to be part of the Quad: Australia, the United States, Japan, and India. And in case any of you have any illusions about that as an alliance of liberal democracies, I say nothing about the United States and the Republican Party at the moment, but I can assure you that Japan is anything but a liberal democracy, and India is a country, or is a state, which it has elections, but it exacts an appalling price from its population in doing so. More importantly, France has been dudded by Scott Morrison. They'll be very bruised by that for a long time. the money was really important. The idea of a deep strategic alliance, which Turnbull tried to form, is gone. But what has already been put in place is French access to Australian military bases from Stirling in Perth and RAF Pearce in Perth, all the bases up the Western Australian coast to Darwin and beyond, particularly the bases in the East Coast, which will support any French military activity in New Caledonia in the event that we return to the bitter conflicts of 20 years ago, which is certainly not impossible. Moreover, not just France has those capabilities, but now we also have India being given the same rights of access to Australian bases in much the same way, allowing both France and Italy, France and, sorry, I'm getting phone calls from family here. France and India really to be not integrated into Australian defence policy, but that base cooperation is continuing. And I forgot to say that France and India now have a series of mutual basing accesses, which of course gives France the capacity to reach from the Middle East through the Indian Ocean, past Australia, to its colonial positions in the Pacific. These might seem not so very important matters, but I think they are, Orcas is part of that. It has deeply dysfunctional aspects, but I think it's really going to be very, very important. Let me just finish by saying, I think that the peace movement, we are a very heterogeneous beast. We are pacifists, we are people who believe firmly in a sovereign Australia. We are people who believe in non-violent defence for Australia. We are people who believe in armed neutrality for Australia. I think that we as a collective, as a group, not in any unified way, but in fact quite diverse ways, have to commit to thinking about what we want for the security of Australia. Everything that Margie and Dave said applies here. We are not a country which faces threat of invasion, and yet our history has been saturated by it. We've got the biggest moat in the world. We ignore the most important thing we could do for our security at the moment, which would be pouring resources into support of an honest government in Papua New Guinea to assist that government with the threat of disease there, which we are finding, surprise, surprise, trickles across the poorest parts of our border. Porous in both sense, poorest and porous in Torres Strait. We don't think about that idea of comprehensive security, of what it would be that would protect Australian interests in a genuine way. I actually think
Richard, you've just gone mute. Richard, you need to repeat your last couple of sentences.
I have no idea how that happened, but it happened. That was quite good. We need to think about what an independent defence policy would mean. I think that means going back to the idea of armed neutrality, but not in the sense of Fortress Australia. And I think that non-violent defence policies have got an important complementary role to play in that, to giving us the confidence that we can deal with whatever threat that is. But Aukus takes us back to dependence. Aukus takes us back to cling to the protection of the empire. We are open to state capture. I would say we have been captured by the defence industries, which is an overseas set of interests. And we have to, in a sense, try and work out how do we get out of this absurdity that a Labor government, a Labor Party, I understand why they can't talk about these issues because they are up against something like Morrison. But we have to get these issues of an independent, non-aligned, non-nuclear, self-reliant Australian defence policy as something that we talk about, and out of that we may get less fear. I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Dave.
Thank you enormously, Richard. That was superb. insightful and really powerful. And thanks so much for your work and for that insight there. And like a lot of people in the chat are saying, thanks for that contribution. And I'm very pleased that the organisers had the foresight to record, because that is absolutely key sort of stuff to have and to share. And you just have an incredible ability to condense complex ideas in a simple, not simplistic, really clear way. That is really good. One thing that personally strikes me, I'm just consistently amazed that we had, like you said earlier in your talk, 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, a dismal failure, and within a year, within a month of an ignominious exit, that abandoned people that we relied on us within a month, without any reflection of that engagement, that longest war, we're announcing Aukus. This is an extraordinarily non-reflective state of being. It's an extraordinarily combative sort of set of policy drivers and people. Later in this event, we're going to have a look at some of the next steps that could be taken, some of the events that are happening to build this momentum for a highly, diverse, broad, inclusive peace movement. But now it's a good opportunity to pick the brains of Margie and Richard, and those brains are considerable, to clarify any issues, to share in the chat any resources or ideas that you have. I've just picked up some questions in the chat and some others that have come in. And I suppose I'll give you a moment to pause and regroup, Richard, after that. And I'll start with you, Margie. And one of the things, like the opportunity cost analysis that you came up was clear and crisp and compelling. One of the other things, though, that you've been involved in or are involved in is ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And I know that ICAN has been doing a lot of thinking around this and concern about non-proliferation aspects and wider considerations. Can you maybe just give us a little snapshot of some of ICAN's concerns about the Orcas proposal?
Yes, the loophole in the provisions for the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that this submarine would exploit is a major problem. It's never been used before. It's likely to tempt a whole lot of other countries to say they want to do exactly the same thing. And, this would range from countries in South America, Brazil, Japan, South Korea, Iran, Israel. There are a huge number of countries who would be likely to say, well, if Australia can do it, why can't we? And that would lead to a huge amount of highly enriched uranium being outside safeguards. Now, Tariq Ralph wrote a terrific article that came out a couple of weeks ago, and I'll actually email that to the organisers, the link. But this is a major, he is an expert in the area of safeguards. I think he was the head of the relevant department in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I don't know his exact title. But this is a major issue and nobody's really talking about it. It's just a significant undermining of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Australia may pretend to be an exceptional power, but we're not. We're just as subject to failure as any other state, subject to corruption, subject to so many things. And to be using to sort of say, but we're the good guys, we can do this and other countries can't, is really disingenuous and highly problematic.
A dangerous precedent that destabilises the international regime, which is under fairly significant pressure anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, there's also major questions whether this technology will get through Congress in the US, let alone, there's so many questions about whether these subs will actually ever happen, but certainly the major undermining of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a big issue. Okay, and also for people, one of the other resources is ICAN has done a report on this, I understand. Oh yes, the troubled waters. I'll get both of those links into the chat. Super, Margie, thanks very much. Now, Richard, I imagine that you have sort of touched on this with the armed neutrality approach.
But a question that's come up a few times in the chat, and it comes up a bit in sort of the front bar and the dinner table, is, well, what's the alternative? What do we do, particularly given that there is, you know, a growing influence of China? How does Australia best position and best protect? Can you give us some of your thoughts on?
Okay, and I think it's, I take pacifist positions on all these things very seriously, but it's not one I think, that's not a position that I finally believe is viable in Australia at the moment as the core of it. So the idea of armed neutrality is based on the work of a man called David Martin 40 years ago in a very fine book called Armed Neutrality for Australia. But the core of that is Australia taking responsibility for its own defence, facing what are really probably best understood as credible contingencies, not worst cases. Worst cases you can think of till the asteroids come and get us, but credible contingencies in our lifetime, and designing something which, based on self-reliance and independent defence, is appropriate for that. And that one of the things that does immediately is to say that you're responsible for your own defence, no one else is. And in particular, because you want to be neutral, now there are various meanings of what precisely neutral means today, but at the very least, not in one camp or the other, but being neutral means you must not have foreign bases on your soil, because if you have, you are absolutely, there could not be any closer declaration of commitment to shared values about that, shared intention to work together militarily. So an independent and self-reliant defence, I think, probably means you need to take certainly non-alignment as a general approach. That might seem strange and stupid. I worked in Indonesia for a long time, and one of the things that always strikes me when I watch Australian defence people and military together with Indonesian defence military and military people, many of whom are actually not people I like very much with very bad records, is the Indonesians really do not understand why Australia needs an alliance. And it's actually not something that they sort of using that for rhetorical effect. They just find it very, very strange. Whereas for Australia, we think this is natural. The idea of armed neutrality, of independent defence policy, what the precise content of that is, has to be measured against what we think the threats are. And you can only talk about that in particulars, you need to go into it. I think that a lot of what Paul Dibb talked about in the 1986 review of Australian defence, where he argued strongly for a defence of Australia, not for defence, not sending troops to the Middle East, to Afghanistan, to Vietnam, but focusing on Australia. And what is required for that still needs to be thought through today. One of the obvious things about Aukus is it's taking us away from that kind of thinking and that capacity. You asked about China. Without wanting to be frivolous about it, what strikes me is that we've been willing since about 1955 to sell China pretty much anything that it wants. I'm actually one of those people who think that Foreign Investment Review Board appraisal of foreign investment in Australia is something that relates to Australian security. We should be doing that on an even playing field, impartially. It's the obvious part of that. But I think the question that you have to ask is, in any serious way, what does Australia have to fear from China? I mean, what precisely is it? Have you seen China building over 800 military bases abroad, like the United States? Have you seen China projecting military power through those bases, through to wars on every continent except Antarctica and Australia? I really think that my own view of China is one which is actually quite mixed. One of the things that when I was working with Malcolm Fraser that we argued about, actually was about China. I think if you're a neighbour of China, you've got a problem. If you're Tibet, if you're Taiwan, if you're Vietnam, if you're Hong Kong, then you have a big problem. And you have a problem principally not because China is some big evil country, but it's a great power. I actually think Paul Keating said it right. Great powers are rude. That might have been a silly throwaway line of his, but they throw their weight around, and they will throw their weight around. So we need a defence policy and an outlook which takes that seriously. But China is a very, very long way from Australia, a very long way from Australia. I think that we need to talk about independent foreign defence policy which couples with regional cooperative security. One of the things that is not said by our government in terms of sending Australian submarines 4,500 kilometres to the East China Sea between Japan and Korea and China, how do they get there? They can only get there by passing through Indonesian waters and Philippine waters. And I can assure you that the Indonesians take the notion of sovereignty as a former colonial country much more seriously than we do. But we just don't even talk about that. They're not even worth talking about. What's it exactly? I think we need a debate in groups like this about what kind of defence policy we want. I think it probably has to be armed. I think it should be neutral, but it has to be a capacity for independence. That's all I'll say at the moment.
That's great. Thank you. I loved your self-reliant and self-assured assessment. It'd be great to add self-reflective to that mix as well. But that's a really thoughtful contribution there, Richard. Thanks. And I think what you're doing is opening up a really important set of discussions and conversations in the broad peace movement about, like, we can critique Orcas, but we need to develop also a sense of how we see the future. And I just wanted to give a shout out too to Greg and Diana. I'm not sure if people are watching the chat, but they're in the Badlands, in the rural areas out of Darwin, and feeling very, very threatened by the tone and the tenor and the build-up of military presence in that patch. And that's a beautiful patch of this country, and you should be feeling hot, but you shouldn't be feeling bothered. And that's a terrible thing. And so to you, Greg and Diana, just like solidarity from us from the coal country. And yeah, and I suppose that's the other side of what Margie was saying. This is the human face and the human erosion and impact already of this sort of creeping and sometimes galloping move towards militarization. Now, soon we're going to move on to the next step sort of things, but I wanted to just pick up a couple of quick things as well, and one back to you, Margie Beavis, and that is that in your experience or in your conversations, are you seeing medical practitioners, healthcare workers, frontline people like that in other Orcas nations also sharing concerns? I noticed that in the chat a little while ago, Annie said that there are concerns in defence in the UK about nuclear issues. Are you seeing healthcare workers or in touch with any in the States or the UK and seeing a common thread about that?
Yes, IPPNW, the International Positions for the Prevention of Nuclear War, are deeply disturbed about the increase. There was some talk of disturbance in Aukus, and they're certainly very interested in our perspectives on Aukus. And the ICANN Australia report we were with the Non-Proliferation Treaty review conference was supposed to be in January, and we were preparing a talk and an event, and people from IPPNW were going to help us do that in New York because we weren't going to be able to travel there. So they were going to present on our behalf, but the whole thing's been deferred. But certainly there's deep concern amongst health professionals internationally.
Thanks, Margie. Richard, a quick one for you, if you can. A question about your comment about Japan and not a liberal democracy. Can you maybe tease that out a little bit more? Yeah.
Okay. Japan has had effectively one government, one party government for almost continuously since the early 1950s, certainly since 1955. It has had only, I think from memory, 2 periods of non-Liberal Democratic Party government. One under Mr. Hosokawa, which lasted about 2.5 years from memory, and then a second one which fell apart after 18 months. There is nothing like, there are 2 things that really you need to understand about Japan. One is there is nothing like, if you like, the circulation of elites that we think we get with a Liberal and Labor Party exchange. There is nothing like the community access to national policy making, except in the case of business. But in terms of the environment, trade unions, the education minister a few years ago was proud to state that neither he nor any other of his predecessors had ever met with the president of the education union. So we didn't talk about them. In the environment movement in Australia, of course, we feel locked out, but we do have access at certain points. We do not have that in Japan. You have many, many wonderful local activities, but they do not accumulate to massive, to great effect. And so actually Japan, I'll give you one instance of why we should be thinking about this. The presence of US military forces in Japan, as in Australia, is governed by a status of forces agreement. We all know that with 1/4 of Okinawa covered by US bases, we have been very large numbers of US Marines there for more than 50 years. There are terrible legal problems resulting from the behaviour of those Marines. The United States has consistently refused Japanese requests that those Marines be subject through the status of forces agreements to Japanese courts because they believe they won't get a fair trial. That's actually a quite accurate assessment by the Americans there. Can I just finish with one last?
Please
one last thing I just want to mention. Mention China. We need to be calling China out for its behaviour, both towards its own citizens, but also in the South China Sea. There are illegal activities, what I believe are illegal activities by China there. We would also be very good if we did so on an even and impartial basis. And we note that Australian forces daily, weekly, operate out of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, which is a small atoll in the Chagos archipelago, from which not only did, like China, is there a massive set of concrete, or a massive concrete island, an extraordinarily important military base there, but to get that access, the United States colluded with Britain in dispossessing the Chagos Islanders, and they were pushed out of those islands. That's, to me, as bad as what happened on a much larger scale in Xinjiang to minorities there. And we simply collude. We close our eyes to the the illegality of that, now recognised by both the United Nations and the World Court, and we continue to cooperate about that. We must be clear about China with China, but we can only do that in good faith if we also talk about the case next door, with which we are much more closely involved.
Very fine words, Richard. We're getting close to the end of this session, but I wanted to throw to you, Margie, just was there any closing comments or observations that you wanted to make?
I suppose it is that really defence procurement is appalling in Australia at this time, and we are building up our defence budget. We're stripping away our foreign aid budget. We're stripping away diplomacy. We're heading in completely the wrong direction. And we're looking down the barrel of governments going on about cuts and stripping away the fabric of our society and our safety net. And I think that really Orcas and these submarines are accelerating all of these trends, and we really need to fight it as much as we can.
Clear and crisp, Margie. Thanks very much. Look, folks, this has been a very productive and engaging and important conversation, and I really thank Margie Beavis and Richard Tanter for their contributions. The current context is really tough. Like, I'd say that we don't have the luxury of despair, and there are lots of connected and committed folks on this call and well beyond. And you know, while it's true that if we act, we don't always win. One thing we can be sure of is that if we don't act, we will always lose. So I would, urge us all to consider some of the issues that have been raised, to give some thinking to those points that Richard in particular has raised about how do we envisage and then realise a future Australia, a different Australia. And in closing, for my little part of this, I want to give you thanks to you crew who have attended for your attention and for your attendance and for your efforts. And I want to hand over to one of the key organisers of tonight, IPAN's Shirley Winton, and she's going to offer some thoughts on next steps for building an effective and inclusive peace movement. So thanks for my part to speakers and everyone for this, and hello, Shirley.
Shirley, you're on mute.
Thanks, Margie. Thanks, Dave, for doing this fantastic job facilitating this meeting and making connections between the speakers' comments, Richard's and Margie's, and also your own insights, and putting it all into a pretty coherent picture, and really putting forward a position that we're finding ourselves in now and the tasks that are facing us. And I think Margie and Richard had really clearly put forward a direction of where we should be going, of the movement for peace and the movement for independent foreign policy should be going to. But we're also grateful to Margie, Beavis and Richard for their minutely detailed acknowledgement presentation of facts. It's just been tremendous. And I should say that the meticulous presentation of facts are really important, and this knowledge that they're sharing with us are really important for us, or for those of us who are involved in building an anti-war peace movement. And having those facts, there's a saying about seeking truth from facts. Having that knowledge arms the people, it arms us in this growing movement for peace. So thank you again, all three of you. Also special thanks to Sam Brennan, who coordinated the technical part of this webinar whilst working in a very busy and demanding full-time job. And of course, thanks to Bernadette McPhee, who very regularly posts the contacts to NOAA Orcas Coalition and IPAN email addresses, the links to statements and the coming events. And the chat can be saved to all your computers if you'd like to continue making contact with us. I'll just say a couple of words that the meeting is being held, as everyone knows. The meeting is being held under the cloud of possibly quite a major war in Europe, and it gives us an inkling of what we may have to face, of what we may be facing in the future as well. And that's again, Richard's comments, I think, are very valuable in giving us that direction of how we can work towards preventing a war in this region. So thanks to all who have supported and promoted and attended this webinar. And it's really heartening to know that the movement for peace, and that is with peace with justice, as we all agree, is growing in Australia. And it gives us confidence that the people of Australia will stand up and push back the war preparations. And there are war preparations by big powers, and of course, our compliant government tagging behind. So there's no more power, and what I really want to say, there's no more powerful force than organised and a broad people's movement for peace and justice. And we are many, we are the majority, and we're the 99%. And although we can be absolutely overwhelmed by the power of the big powers striding the world, we are the majority. And it is really heartening to see and to hear that there are movements right across the world, right around the world, building broad movements against war and for peace. People want peace. We want secure livelihoods. We want health. and to live in a clean and safe environment for everyone. And we have only one answer to wars, and our answer is that it is to build a broad, united mass movement for peace against wars of aggression. A movement of people from all walks of life demanding peace, justice, and a healthy environment. It's not really much to ask for. And when you have over 100 billion spent on war submarines, nuclear submarines, it just does not make sense. The contradiction is just so enormous and just really difficult to accept. We encourage and welcome everyone to join us in building this movement, and our common aim that keeps us working together and building this people's movement is our desire for peace and justice and no wars of aggression, as everyone's been saying. Opposition to Orcas and big powers' preparations for war is what keeps us working together. And we might have different opinions on other issues, but what glues this growing movement is our unity in opposition to war and for an independent foreign policy and respect for each other. And we do all respect each other. And we aim to build this unity through respecting each other and treating each other with equality. So the power of the collective action is what really motivates us and builds this movement. So the next major anti-Orcas national event will be on Palm Sunday, that's on 10th of April, in every major city. The contacts for the national and Victorian anti-Orcas coalition are in the chat. So for people from other states attending this webinar, please email the National Anti-Orcas Coalition email address, which is in the chat, to find out about activities in your own states. In Victoria, the No Orcas Coalition, Victoria will be participating in Palm Sunday in Melbourne under the banner of Palm Sunday for Peace, Justice and the Environment. Orcas equals wars, Orcas equals refugees. So the other events that are coming up, there's a Zoom webinar on the 23rd of March organised by IPAM, and the title of it is An Alternative Defences for Australia, which is exactly what Richard had been referring to in his talk. So it's very topical. There's a lot of work that has gone into it by members of IPAM and other people like Richard. The speakers will be Albert Palazzo and Sue Rossen, and there'll probably be a couple of other speakers. So Bernie, Rita, Margaret, Dave, are there any other things that we need to alert people to? Except to say thank you for coming, and let's continue building this united movement. That is our answer, and that is where the power of the people lies. So thank you really very much, everyone.
Thanks, Shirley. Great.
Okay, so we all go home now and start
dinner.
building the movement, start talking to our neighbours, start talking to our workmates. Great. Well, thank you again, everyone, for coming, and everyone probably needs to go and have their tea, have their dinner, or watch some TV.